Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the humanities teaching platform and app. You can go and beta test the website over at noetic.online. We have a very special presentation today, or interview, I should say. We're going to be talking to Dr. Jonathan Cook about a really incredible book, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Blithedale Romance. Now, I have I have so many questions about this book, and I know you have certain things that you want to hit as well. This is a fascinating text, and you can drill down on so many different aspects of it. It's going to be pretty ambitious to try to cover it all in one session today, but I know if there's anyone who can do it, it's you. So, I guess maybe before we just begin, before I draw up the formal questions here, what drew you to this book?
I love the persona of the narrator. I mean, it's Hawthorne's only first-person full-length novel. So Miles Coverdale is a fascinating character because he's very self-deprecating but eloquent, sort of caricature of Hawthorne himself. I mean, there's no doubt that Hawthorne was drawing on elements of his own personality, but he was presenting this narrator who has a sort of whimsical and ironic personality that is unlike any other narrative persona in his fiction. So there's a certain verve and humor to the narrator that I really enjoy. I mean, the narrator of other novels, especially The House of Seven Gables, has some humorous elements to him, but this, first-person narrator has some wonderfully wry comments about human nature, about himself, about some of his more unappealing traits. So he's very conscious of his weaknesses as well as his abilities. I mean, he's a minor poet, so he's self-deprecating about his lack of poetic ability, and so you have to give him credit for being honest about himself. So I think this is a function of the Hawthorne's employment of what was called romantic irony, which means creating an ironic perspective that is very self-conscious about its own generativity. The creative process is exposed within the narrator himself, because he's constantly talking about the fact that he is creating this story as he goes along, and the other characters comment on how he is going to be writing it up as a ballad, as a poem, and he himself compares his role to that of being an observer at a grand tragedy. So I like that element too, the romantic irony.
Yeah, definitely. And you've kind of weighed in on it a little bit here. I know in the preface, doesn't Hawthorne say that don't get it twisted, no one in here is a real person, right? He does this disclaimer, but it seems like there are all sorts of parallels and connections to real life people, you know, including himself and including events in his life. I'll have to say that something that I love, I don't know a ton about Hawthorne, but Hawthorne was really important in my own sort of personal awakening. I've gone through sort of an unusual elevation of consciousness this year, and I think Hawthorne had a big part in that. And he weaves a lot of very interesting subjects into his text, and this one has it too, right? We've got allusions to the transcendentalist community at Brook Farm, right? Yeah. I don't know if you're going to talk about that at all, and this clairvoyance, right? Yeah. Like he seems to be very familiar with the occult, and even references to Luciferianism, and I don't know. I mean, when those subjects start to get hit on, I get very interested in the text.
Well, it's sort of a cross section about New England culture in the early 1840s, because it was a time of cultural reform. The country was in the midst of a major depression. It began with the Panic of 1837, and ran pretty much until about 1843. So about 6 years of slowdown economically, and a lot of cities were hard hit in particular. In fact, the founder of Brook Farm was a minister, a Unitarian minister,
right,
who was friends with Emerson and some of the Transcendentalists, named George Ripley, and he had an inner city parish in Boston, and his resignation from that parish was to found this community which would set an example of cooperative labor that would presumably, if it caught on as a model, that it would lead to a more just society where, the working people weren't as segregated from the middle class and the upper class, and they were not stuck in poverty, and they were living a healthy life in the countryside. So it was a direct response to the economic downturn of the era, but this happened at the same time that all these other social experiments were taking place, these utopian communities, which really had their peak in the 1840s because of the economy, and some of them were based on the ideas of Charles Fourier, whose name comes up in the book as a theoretician of utopian communities. He had a very specific model about these groups called phalansteries, which would be about, I think, 1,500 people living together, and everyone would have a certain job, and they'd rotate their jobs periodically, so they never did the same thing all the time. So it would create a little variety. Anyway, Brook Farm was not directly inspired by that model, although they about 3 years after Hawthorne was there, they switched to the Fourierist model, and people sometimes date the decline of the community from that switch from a more sort of transcendentalist, open community idea to the more Fourierist model of rotation of workers. And so
I have kind of a rosy view of Brook Farm.
Yeah,
I don't know if I ought to. I mean, in some ways, one of the reasons I'm attracted to whenever any author weaves something about Brook Farm into text is that it seems like, at least digitally, I might be inadvertently making one. Yeah. And then I think about how an internet entity could maybe come to have a physical correlate one day. I live on a farm right now. And I'm like, maybe I should, maybe this thing should become Brook Farm 2.0 one day. I don't know. Something I've always wondered about Brook Farm is, do you know, do they have any doctrinal texts that they founded themselves on? And what's your perspective on Brook Farm?
George Ripley's ideas were really the model, and you bought stock in Brook Farm. Hawthorne bought 2 shares, actually, and put out a fair amount of money for the time. In fact, he left with George Ripley still owing him the money, and he was actually suing him 10 years later to get it back, and he never did. So he sunk some money into that, and of course it wasn't supposed to make money, but it was supposed to break even at least, so that, or maybe it was supposed to make a little bit of a profit, but they were organized with their constitution, which I guess that George Ripley wrote, and I don't remember reading through it, but I think it was pretty much a simple statement about the rules of what you could or couldn't do. But it was pretty much a bunch of intellectual New Englanders who got together, and they had a farm there already, and they did a lot of outdoor labor, and they also had a school that was very well run. It had a very good curriculum, and a few people sent their kids there. They also had a lot of boarders who paid money to stay with them, so they could actually make money that way. But the core of Brook Farm really never got much over 100 or so. I mean, the first members, there were only about a dozen or so, I think, stock holders in the beginning. So it was always a very small community, and there was just a lot of interesting characters there.
Was Margaret Fuller there?
Well, Margaret Fuller came as a visitor. She was never a member, but she came to talk to people because she was kind of a celebrity at the time. This was shortly before she moved to New York City and started writing for the Horace Greeley's Tribune. But she was a regular visitor. Emerson decided not to join. He didn't want to compromise his individuality, but he supported their goals. And some other lesser-known writers and journalists lived there, like George Curtis, who later became an editor of Harper's Magazine in the 1850s and 60s, and he became an important social reformer after the Civil War. He was there as a young man, and Charles Dana was also a journalist who later worked for the Sun in New York. And there was also a very good music critic and writer who was there. So there was always interesting people to talk to, and a lot of young people as well. And after Brook Farm ended in about 1848, they had a fire that burned down their new main building, and they couldn't rebuild it because they hadn't insured it. People wrote memoirs. Some of the younger people wrote memoirs recalling just how much fun it was to live there, because they had
I bet.
just a bunch. It was like going to summer camp, except it was year round. So
it's like intellectual grown-up summer camp.
Yeah.
Well, I heard I think I caught something out of the corner of my eye that maybe this character Zenobia in Blithedale Romance might have some connection to Margaret Fuller.
Margaret Fuller, yeah, definitely it does, and it's interesting because there was a controversy after the novel was published about how much Zenobia reflected Margaret Fuller, because Margaret Fuller, she was idolized by a lot of people in New England as a pioneering feminist. And, she had died in July 1850. She had drowned when her ship bringing her back from Italy with her husband and her child wrecked off the coast of Long Island. And, the ship was within sight of land, and it was in a terrible summer storm, and hit some rocks and split open, and Margaret Fuller was drowned with her husband and with her child. So there was a sense of great sense of loss for a lot of people. Like Emerson was close to her. On the other hand, she was coming back to New York with a little bit of a questionable reputation about her marriage. In fact, whether she was married or not, because she had gotten involved with an Italian in Rome named Asoli, who was a member of the minor nobility, and he was a younger man than she was, and they had a child together. And Margaret Fuller claimed to have married him, but the question was, did she do so before the child was born? And the question also was whether she had actually been married or not. So coming back to the U.S., a lot of her friends were afraid of the scandal that might ensue when she had to sort of explain her husband and child and whether she actually was married to the guy or not. So, but of course, her people like Emerson and some of her other close friends didn't, were heartbroken about her loss. And Hawthorne, of course, knew Margaret Fuller from the early 1840s because when she visited Brook Farm, they talked, and she also came to Concord, Massachusetts, where he lived when he got married in 1842, just before she went to New York. So he knew her, fairly well, and Fuller admired Hawthorne, and she admired his marriage. It was a companionate marriage because Hawthorne's wife, Sophia, was intellectual, and Hawthorne and she were kind of a model as far as cooperative sharing tasks in their household.
Man, this is so fascinating. I mean, I just want to do like a whole study on Brook Farm and all these individuals associated with it.
Yeah,
I got to figure out how to do it. But I mean, I would imagine that there were other circumstances besides Brook Farm that affected the composition of this text that you want to bring to light.
Well, let me just. I want to just finish with Fuller because the interesting thing is, and I wrote an article about this, that Fuller served as the model. I mean, there are at least 10 or so ways that Zenobia resembles Fuller, including the death by drowning, the dubious nature of her marriage, the sort of feminist ideology that each of them is promoting, the artistic predilections, the association with classical culture and the South. But in fact, there is a sort of triangular relationship here because Fuller's influence as a model is coupled with that of a literary character named Corinne, who was the subject of a famous novel by Madame de Staël from 1807. So Corinne, or Italy, was a very well-known book in not only in France but in England and America, because it's de Staël's most famous novel. She was the author of a book about Germany that brought a lot of the German philosophers to people's knowledge for the first time.
Oh, wow.
Kant and Hegel and whatnot. But she created this heroine who's sort of an early feminist model about a woman who is this artistic person who creates spontaneous poetry. She's called an improvisatrice, so she sort of spontaneously creates verse, and she's the half-sister of another young woman.
Freestyle rapper.
Freestyle, yeah. Freestyle poet. And she's... One of the things about the book is that it gives you a real tour of Italy and Rome. I mean, people read it as though it was kind of like taking an excursion through Italy at this time and in the early 19th century. But it also provides a little bit of a source for the plot of Blithedale Romance, because Corinne has a half-sister who is favored by this guy named Oswald, whom Corinne knows in Italy. And the expectation is maybe they're going to get married, but then Oswald goes back to England and he finds out his father didn't want him to marry Corinne. He wanted him to marry the half-sister Lucy, or Lucille. So the father sort of tips the balance, or the father dies, and when this guy Oswald is back in England, he decides to marry Lucy because he thinks that maybe Corinne has forgotten about him, and he also thinks that she's a more desirable companion because she's less complicated, she's more traditional, she doesn't have an artistic temperament. So in a way this resembles the competition between Zenobia and Priscilla in the novel, and the fact that Zenobia is the wealthy, glamorous, artistic older sister, and Priscilla is the younger, more, well, in this case she's the poor but spiritually empowered young woman who acts as Westerveld's subject in his mesmeric demonstrations, because what Priscilla is doing as the veiled lady is to provide entertainment to people as under hypnosis. There was dozens of people in Boston in the 1840s providing demonstrations of hypnosis. It was called mesmerism at the time, and it was just kind of entertainment that you would go to, and that's what the narrator, Miles Coverdale, at the beginning of the book, is walking out of one of these mesmeric entertainments where he's seen this veiled lady, and that, of course, is Priscilla, being exploited by this kind of satanic kind of guy who is named Westerveld, and it turns out he's actually likely Zenobia's estranged husband, you know. So
that was the thing that was one of the things that caught my attention, is that Hawthorne does seem to be aware of Satanism. The thing I first picked up on it was in Young Goodman Brown.
Yeah. Well,
where was he? You know, what made him so interested in that? Where was he getting that?
Well, I think it's partly because he's a Puritan, so the old idea of the devil being active in the world was still in the air. I mean, certainly as a citizen of Salem, Massachusetts, you couldn't escape the influence of the idea of demonic possession.
Did he believe in it?
No. I mean, he exploited it as a literary device. Plus, there's a strong influence of Goethe's Faust here, because Mephistopheles, you know, Goethe died in 1832, so the Faust Part 1 and 2 was read and widely disseminated. So Mephistopheles became the model for the devil for many 19th century writers. And the idea of the gentleman devil, you know, not the guy with the horns and the pitchfork and the cloven hoofs, it's more the gentleman, you know, with the glowing eyes periodically, but the casuist and the debater and the spirit of, you know, the skeptic that becomes the model for the devil, which is kind of what you find in Westerveld, because he hovers between being a traditional Satan figure, you know, with his little flashing tip of his, you know, with his snake-like walking stick and the diamond stud that he has on his shirt. But beyond that, he is conveyed to be a skeptic and a sort of materialist. So he sort of hovers between the traditional sort of Lucifer, Satan, and the Mephistopheles devil, who is the devil of the 19th century, thanks to Goethe's portrayal of that figure.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. That's great context. All right, so we talked about Brook Farm.
Yeah, and I just want to let me mention that Hawthorne joins Brook Farm in the spring of 1841. He's only there about 6 months, but he leaves, just like Coverdale, he leaves kind of in the late summer to go back and do things in Boston. So he was never very firmly committed to Brook Farm, although when he got there, he had thought originally he was going to marry Sophia and they would live there together. But after spending a few months there and realizing that he was exhausted, you know, shoveling manure all day, and he didn't have the energy to write, he realized that he made a terrible mistake, that he could not continue as a writer and also do all this manual labor. It just was, you know, he was not going to physically able to meet the challenge. So he left for a while and went to Boston and did some things, and he came back, and so he was visiting on and off in the fall of 1841, and then of course later that in the early summer he married Sophia and moved with her to Concord, Massachusetts. So that's the history of his involvement. It's kind of about the same time frame as Miles Coverdale. And Hawthorne, too, had a terrible cold when he arrived, and there was a big snowstorm the day that he was going to Brook Farm. So all of that is very much autobiographical.
I forgot to ask you this, because I wanted to make sure you got a chance to plug the article that you had written about the connection between Zenobia and Margaret Fuller. Where can people find that?
It's right here. It's a journal called Prospects.
Okay.
And,
is it online or is
it? Well, I'm not sure if you can find it on JSTOR. So it came out, it's volume 28 of Prospects. It's not published anymore. It ended its publication run. It was published out of Columbia University. And it was a very good review of cultural studies, not just literature.
What was the name of your article?
And my article is called "One of the Most Gifted Women of the Age: Zenobia Margaret Fuller and de Stael's Corinne in the Blithedale Romance." So it's kind of triangulating. Here's the article. Triangulating the relationship between the character of Zenobia Margaret Fuller and de Stael's Corinne, because not many people have made that connection with all the three of them, but it's kind of an interlinked set of influences there.
Well, if you ever want to, maybe we can talk about that more in depth one day. I mean, I personally love your commentary. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the next question I had here was, and I think you've alluded to it somewhat, but I don't know if you want to expand on how the novel reflects the reform culture going on at this time in America in the 30s and 40s of the 19th century. I mean, you talked about it a little. Do you want to say more?
Yeah. Well, the utopian movements, of course, were a direct result of the sort of collapsed economy and people trying to invent new ways to associate themselves. I mean, as we said, Fourier was the big name in the 1840s, but there have been other communities springing up here and there. But the other thing is that we have several traces of other reform movements. Temperance, of course, was a big movement trying to limit the consumption of alcohol, which had actually reached epidemic levels in the early 19th century. I mean, tons of people were just drinking lots of hard liquor because it was so cheap. There were no liquor taxes, so you could get a bottle of whiskey for a few cents. And people, because not all the water was safe, people thought that you should really drink alcohol to waking up in the morning and get a good start, with a shot of whiskey. So
there was probably some truth to that, but
yeah, it probably so. But so there was a big movement in favor of restraining, limiting alcohol consumption, and debates about whether it should just be hard liquor or whether it should include beer and wine. And a lot of the evangelical community got involved in temperance lecturing, and all kinds of organizations started. There was a group called the Washingtonians, which is sort of a working class temperance movement beginning in the early 1840s. But Miles Coverdale refers to that when he goes to the bar in Boston to meet Moody. He's sitting there and he's looking at all the guys drinking, and he says, these temperance people, they'll never succeed because people need a way to sort of forget about their troubles and to momentarily experience this vision of the ideal, which only alcohol can bring you. So, I mean, Hawthorne himself was he was a moderate drinker, but he definitely was not a temperance man because he knew just how unrealistic it was to ban all alcohol. I mean, as some places were doing. I mean, Maine, in the early 1850s, there was the Maine law, which pretty much limited all alcohol. And, of course, America itself ended up with prohibition in, 1919, which was an insane experiment in keeping, alcohol from ruining families.
Perhaps well-intentioned, but I mean, the issue with that, the prohibition laws, is how it fostered the mafia activity, right?
Yeah, led to massive law breaking by most of American citizens. But I come from a long line of moonshiners from Southern Virginia. Although but I'm a total teetotaler, so there's some karmic rearrangement there. Well, Yeah,
I guess
another reform movement is the Hollingsworth prison reform, which was active in the 1830s and 40s because there were new ideas about how to reform criminals, and one of the very idea of a penitentiary, which was pioneered in Auburn, New York, was supposed to put criminals in these isolated cells where they would be penitent about their crimes and they would reform themselves, right? So there was a lot of reformers who were trying to pioneer these new prison designs and to help prisoners integrate back into the community. So Hollingsworth's big dream is to, build this sort of reform institution that would help criminals integrate back into society. And there were people in Boston and New York and elsewhere who were devoted to these ideals.
I can only imagine, too, that it wasn't that the prison situations weren't very discerning, because I can only imagine at this time that the mentally handicapped oftentimes got grouped with
prisoners,
with criminal elements. Was that an issue that they were trying to reform?
Well,
I'm just speculating because I
could
see situations where people would be considered a problem and just thrown in the clink.
Well, I don't think that was so much an issue because there were asylums for the poor. I mean, there was a big revolution in the treatment of the poor and the insane and the prison population at this time, and there was an attempt to sort of rationalize it and to create these what were called asylums for poor people, and sometimes the mentally ill ended up there. So
I see. What about what about the temperance issue? Was that a response to widespread drunkenness?
Definitely.
Were people more alcoholic back then than say today? I have no idea how to even measure that.
I think it was like this is a rough statistic, but there was like 8 or 9 gallons of liquor that were drunk yearly by the average person. So a massive, and now it's like 1 or 2 gallons, per person. So a huge number of people were drinking a lot of hard liquor, and there was a lot of public drunkenness. I mean, if you read about Congress in the Jacksonian era, I mean, there are just all kinds of people who are drunk half the time when they're in Congress or on the streets, and women felt terrible because their husbands would come home drunk and beat the children and beat the wife. So it was a big social issue that was united women and the evangelical community into an attempt to draw attention to this very, very serious social problem, and it did actually work. But the question is, where did you draw the line?
Right.
Would you outlaw how much hard liquor would you be allowed to buy, and should it include bans or restrictions on beer and wine? And of course, in the communion service you're drinking wine, so how can you cut back on something that Jesus said that everyone should be drinking? And his first miracle in the book of John was transforming water to wine. So Christ approved of wine, so what's the big deal,
Well, he may have approved of wine, but not
not
for us.
Not public drunkenness. Yeah.
Well, that raises very interesting questions about the causes of the drunkenness. I mean, I think you said something to the effect of that people were using it for escapism. I mean, did people have? I mean, it's not. We're talking pre-Civil War, so
it was.
And you're also
there was
saying
a masculine culture of alcohol, and it was very cheap. So working men were often drunk on the job. Primarily, the male population were the problem because of the impact it had on families, the impact it had on productivity, and the impact it had on just setting the moral tone for the nation. Because a lot of foreign visitors commented on the public drunkenness that they would see in the United States in the 1820s and 30s and whatnot. So So anyway,
there was one more question I wanted to ask, and how it all ties into all this, and how the transcendental movement at Brook Farm might be connected to the public drunkenness in some way. I mean, what is your kind of understanding of the transcendental doctrine? I mean, is it essentially kind of just like to be at one with the Platonic ideal, or through beauty or something like that? Or
well, I mean, we have to say that
it was a different way of responding to the drunkenness.
Well, Transcendentalism was famous for saying that reform had to be individual, not collective. So they pretty much, Emerson and Thoreau and Alcott, to some extent, maybe not Alcott, but Emerson and Thoreau were famously averse to joining reform movements.
Right.
So because they thought that individuals have to make a change of heart to change their behavior. You can't have these collective groups doing it. You have to do it yourself.
I see.
And Brook Farm, I mean, you could only call it a transcendental utopia to the degree that George Ripley was the founder and head, because he was a reader and supporter of Emerson, but he was by no means was he teaching and promoting transcendentalism at Brook Farm. I mean, he was pretty much pioneering the idea of sort of Christian socialism is what he was doing, more than transcendentalism.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So much to discuss there. That's going down a rabbit hole, but it's unfortunately it's one that I find to be quite intoxicating.
Yeah.
So let's see here. Perhaps you could say a little bit more about Miles Coverdale as the narrator.
Yeah.
And is there something special about this narrative technique that Miles uses, or that Hawthorne uses?
Yeah. So Miles Coverdale, it's interesting because his name derives from one of the translators of the Bible. The Coverdale Bible was a early 16th century version of the Bible by this Anglican minister who was one of the early pre-King James authorized version translators of the Bible. I mean, he didn't translate every word from Hebrew and Greek. He took different versions. A lot of these people took Luther's German version and turned it into English. Right. And that was considered, legitimate, because Luther's version was very distinguished as a faithful rendition. So Miles Coverdale, he bears this sort of weighty name as an Elizabethan or pre-Elizabethan translator of the Bible. And Miles, of course, comes from the Latin miles, which means soldier. So it's kind of a joke of a name, because Miles Coverdale is kind of a lazy Epicurean dilettante who doesn't have any real religious conviction or anything, but he bears the name of someone who was a famous translator of the Bible. And he's not a soldier of Christ or soldier of God. He is sort of, intentionally weak guy who can't really get his priorities straight. I mean, he's a very interesting character, and he kind of beats himself up for his lack of commitment. But his very problem is he doesn't have commitment to the ideals of the community. He doesn't have a commitment to people. He's kind of an observer and a skeptic. Just like Hawthorne himself was famous for being a sort of impersonal observer of people around him, and being a little bit cold-hearted about some of his relationships, as being too eager to sort of drain people of their essence and then put it into his fiction or his literature. So Coverdale is a caricature of Hawthorne himself as a literary artist who's kind of a intellectual predator on his subjects. I mean, he has too much detachment from the characters. At least that's what they say. Zenobia blames him for being an observer who's just going to turn her story into a poem. And so at the end of the book, of course, he confesses to something he's never told anyone, which is he was in love with Priscilla. And you see his essential personal shortcoming in Zenobia's fable that she tells about this young man Theodore, when that little performance piece that she does at the community before everyone disperses to Boston, or before Coverdale goes to Boston. He's depicted as a sort of dilettantish young man who's interested in this veiled lady, but he doesn't have the incentive to kiss her under her, through her veil, without looking at her face, whether she's a pretty girl or not. So it's sort of a parable of commitment and faith, which he feels he lacks.
What does this veil represent? I mean, there's so much allusion to it.
Yeah.
I mean, I read a Schiller poem for Noetic not long ago, and it was. Do you know this poem, "The Veiled Image at Sais"?
Yeah, yeah.
It's a famous, pretty incredible poem. I mean, it's just bouncing around in my head, and I was like, "Is there any connection?"
Well, I think it's a romantic metaphor. Yeah. I think it's a metaphor for the elusiveness of truths,
right?
And
that's what that poem's
secrecy,
about.
Right?
Yeah.
Because everyone at Blithedale has a secret, and the big secret is not discovered until the end of the book, when you find out who Zenobia is and who Priscilla really is and who Moody is. I mean, all these revelations happen pretty much in the last few chapters, just like the House of the Seven Gables. Because the whole book is kind of a mystery, like who are these people, how are they related to each other, what is Moody doing when he goes to the community, what is Westerville doing. So it's a sort of a thematics of revelation that governs the book, and it ties into the biblical idea of revelation as well.
Doesn't revelation mean unveiling?
Yeah. Apocalypse is the Greek word for revelation. Taking off the veil and getting the truth. Unveiling ultimate things. Because the book is pretty much an apocalyptic text. It's Brook Farm itself was partly inspired by the millennial hopes of the era, when it was considered that if you get enough social reform going, you'll create a perfected community, so that you will end up in this sort of post-millennial world where Christ will be inhabiting the community, but not physically, but after the millennium has already occurred. The difference is premillennialism means Christ comes back, and then the millennium happens after his apocalyptic appearance. But millennialism was the dominant belief system for most Christians at the time, and that meant that you kind of work your way towards the millennium by performing, perfecting your society. Morally.
Yeah, you're like co-workers, right? And you're accelerating and becoming eschaton, which is which is very interesting to me, because
it's ironic because the millennium, when you reach the millennium, it's like you're going forward, but you're also going back to the Garden of Eden. So there's a sort of duplicate movement forward progressively and then backward archetypally to Eden, because there are all kinds of allusions to Eden, and Zenobia claims that she's not going to work in the nude. It's because it's too cold. So they joke about the fact that they are recreating Eden at the community at the same time they're trying to recreate the millennium. Now, the irony, of course, is that the more they try to perfect themselves in their community, the more they are going to be reenacting the fall, so that you actually have the devil appearing in the form of Westervelt with his snake walking stick, who's tempting Zenobia to hand over Priscilla to go back to being a mesmeric veiled lady, right? So the fall is recreated by a devil-like figure, and Zenobia and Priscilla are kind of both Eve-like creatures. Priscilla more so because she's the victim of the devil who comes, but Zenobia is kind of a Lilith figure because she, Lilith was the mythical woman who was supposed to be married to the devil or his consort, and
I've also heard that Lilith might have been Adam's first wife. If you read,
exactly, Adam's first wife.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
And people shouldn't take that seriously. It's from
Jewish legend.
I think
it's
it's
Jewish
from the
legend, rabbinic elaboration of the Bible. So it's
Is it from the
folklore.
Book of Adam and Eve? Is that what it's
No,
from?
it's folklore from the from the early medieval era. Yeah, so it was Adam's first wife. She was too rebellious. Adam divorced her, and she became the consort of the devil. And then there was a second Eve who came and replaced Lilith. That's the legend, and it's a fun story, and it was very influential in the 19th century because you had people like Dante Gabriel Rossetti making paintings of Lilith, and you had George MacDonald, a British novelist, writing a novel called Lilith. So it was a very strong influence, particularly in England, but also to some extent in America.
I'm looking here at Wikipedia, and it says it was developed earliest, the idea of Lilith, that is, in the Babylonian Talmud, so the 3rd to 5th century.
Okay, yeah.
And I'm looking at a painting of Lilith from John Collier.
Okay.
Yeah,
she was a lot of 19th century art. Yeah,
quite lovely.
Yeah, she was a seducer of men, and she was a stealer of children. She borrowed her identity from a Middle Eastern female devil figure from mythology of Mesopotamia. So anyway, there is an archetypal story going on in Blithedale Romance of the fall being recreated in the midst of a quest for perfection, which is pretty much a thematic concern or the dominant thematic concern in the book, because here these people come and they're trying to recreate Eden, and what do they find up with? They end up with sin and death. Zenobia kills herself. They have to create the first grave on the site of their community, and Hollingsworth feels like he's sinned permanently. He can't get over the fact that he feels guilty about killing Zenobia by the way he treated her.
Well, I mean, this raises, we were talking about some of these archetypes and whatnot, but we see this occur in other aspects of Hawthorne's authorship as well. And, obviously to me, it rang a lot of bells in regards to Young Goodman Brown, like I said earlier. Having the small community, even the staff, right? Isn't there a character in Young Goodman Brown that has a snake-like staff? Yeah. Can you? I mean, I imagine that there are more parallels about allegories than these two works. Where else do we see parallelism in Hawthorne's authorship in regards to these themes?
Well, I mean, the fall is pretty much the dominant theme in a lot of his fiction. Scarlet Letter. You have the devil figure in Chillingsworth, and sort of Eve. Adam and Eve are the two protagonists for that book, Hester and Dimmesdale, and we end up with the death of Dimmesdale and Chillingsworth at the end, and the dominant theme in a lot of Hawthorne is the idea of recognition that human nature is flawed, and it's a very much of a Christian theme, but it's not doctrinally enforced. But it's the question of original sin, that we still bear this flawed nature that we can't ignore, and if we try to do so, then we're going to screw up in a bad way. So all of his books are enactments of the fall in one way or the other, and there's usually some villain who has ties with the devil. Chillingsworth in Scarlet Letter, and Judge Pynchon in The House of the Seven Gables and Westerveld, and then you have the artist model in The Marble Faun, Hawthorne's last full-length novel.
Ooh, I don't know that one.
Yeah. This was a dominant theme in his work. Rappaccini's Daughter is a wonderful story, his longest work of short fiction, very much based on the idea of the fall.
What do you think about this whole idea of repeating the same themes over and over again?
Well, it's what authors...
Do you not?
Yeah.
Do you like that? Do you not like that? Do you think it's lazy? Like, I get... my area of expertise, for anyone who has never listened to me before, is Kierkegaard. And, it's a double-edged sword, because sometimes I just think he's so repetitious, but then at the other time, like, he finds a new way to elaborate within this constrained set of ideas, and he's able to really drill down and develop a universe within it. So I have mixed feelings about it, and that's why I enjoy reading so widely about so many other subjects, is because I just get stuck in the repetition of his main ideas. What do you think about it?
Well, Hawthorne varied this theme in so many ways that you never really fault him for taking it on. And
that's how
he was very much of his time. I mean, America in the 1830s and 40s was very much a Christian nation, very much a Protestant country, and you really couldn't get away from religious ideas, and Hawthorne, so he was reflecting the dominant ideology of his culture by writing fiction that mirrored the primordial, prototypical story of the Bible, the third chapter of Genesis. And so I think he does a masterful job just adapting this story to many different circumstances. I mean, he's never preaching to you. He's just showing characters.
No.
In very many different circumstances and historical eras, encountering evil either within themselves or outside themselves. So, I mean, it's very much a reflection of the era that he's writing like this, and of the fact that he's a Puritan from Salem, Massachusetts, one of whose relatives was a founder of an early important figure in Salem in the 17th century.
So this is kind of an interesting question about his biography. Is that I think, I like our dynamic, because, I think we represent maybe different types of intellectuals, right? Like, what I love so much about you as a scholar is this sort of dispassionate, cool, deliberate interpretation of the facts. Whereas I look at myself in the mirror, and I'm a neurotic, right? Like, I'm really, I'm an obsessive who gets really worked up about things. And both attitudes as creators and discerners of the truth are very important. But I'm kind of wondering where, if this is the scale, where was Hawthorne? Was he obsessed? Was he coolly dispassionate? Did he take on different personas through his life as he was writing these texts? Because it seems a little bit like a fixation. Yeah,
I mean, he was a very deliberate creator, but he obviously he was obsessed with being a great literary artist, and he wrote very beautiful prose. I mean, if you notice his style, it's just it's kind of almost 18th century in its clarity and the beauty of its structure. And, you might even compare him to Flaubert in terms of being obsessed with putting things just the right way. But I mean, I think
did he ever
he
suffer
definitely
any
was.
Do you ever
He
suffer
definitely
any bouts
had
of
a
madness or anything?
No, I think he definitely had a depressive side. I mean, he cracked up towards the end of his life where he couldn't write anything, and he was so depressed by the Civil War, and he was sort of stigmatized by the community of Concord in the early 1860s that he pretty much was not really functioning very well, and he couldn't finish any work that he started, so he left a lot of unfinished manuscripts. So he definitely had a strain of depression and some neuroses. It's kind of mysterious about what actually ailed him. I mean, he would be susceptible to depression, of course, because of the early death of his father when he was just a young boy, and seeing his mother, a single mother, throughout her life, mourning for her lost husband. So there was definitely a circumstances promoting depressive illness. And Hawthorne also was famous for having some kind of reticence that made people thought that he had some kind of secret that was disturbing him. I mean, Melville claimed that there was some personal secret that no one ever knew about that was affected his mental health or something, and people have speculated about it.
That was one of the things I was reading about this, is that, and you and I have talked about this before in other texts, and who even knows? But I've heard some modern critics say that there's some sort of homosexual relationship going on in this text.
Well, yeah,
and
I don't
does that
really
relate to this personal secret?
Well, I think some critics.
That stuff.
Well, no. I mean, it's perfectly legitimate to raise the issue, but there is no evidence of this. I mean, there's more of a homosocial relationship of Hollingsworth and Coverdale, but it's never resembles anything like a gay relationship. But Hawthorne himself, the idea was maybe he was molested by his uncle Robert because he slept in the same bed with him at one point, and his mother's brother. But I don't. That's kind of implausible. I think
it's reaching.
He didn't like his mother's relatives because he grew up as a dependent in the family, his mother's family, and always felt like he was a poor relation within his mother's brother's business. They had a stage company, actually, running between Salem and other communities. So Hawthorne definitely was a neurotic figure, but we still don't know a lot about what the sources of that neurosis was, apart from the depression that he probably suffered as an orphan.
I see. Well, I think we've got two closing things to talk about here a little bit. We've talked a little bit about Hollingsworth and Priscilla and Westervelt in passing. Would you like to elaborate on these characters, and maybe even Moody as well? Or
well, it's interesting because Zenobia is really the only one who is definitely based on a biographical model. I mean, the other characters, people have tried to speculate about who might have provided a partial model. So we really can't say. I mean, people thought maybe Hollingsworth, when he has this falling out with Hawthorne, might have been partly based on Melville, because Hawthorne, left Lenox, Massachusetts in November 1851, and Melville was very upset by his departure. But I think it's a bit of a stretch for that. I think one interesting influence here is Moby Dick, because Hawthorne read Moby Dick. The book is dedicated to him, and he thought it was a wonderful book. And I think some of the sort of the narrative elan of Coverdale has this sort of Ishmaelian, freewheeling sense of humor and irony that he might have borrowed from Melville. And it could be that the falling out between Coverdale and Hollingsworth duplicates Starbuck's unwillingness to sympathize with Ahab's mission on the Pequot. So there was some a critic wrote this up, and I found it fairly convincing that there might be a little influence there.
I think it's interesting, yeah.
And as far as the other characters, I mean, they are sort of representative models of types who you would have found at Brook Farm. It's notable that the novel doesn't really give you a panoramic view of everyone at Brook Farm. I mean, you only focus on you have this focus on of just a few characters who seem to be the only ones there. But in fact, there were dozens of people living and working at Brook Farm, and you only get a sense of that later on in the book when Coverdale comes back, and while the community is having a masquerade party, and you have all these different characters described in their masquerade costume, but you really don't get a real full sense of the community by reading about these characters, because the storyline is very narrowly focused on these few people at the community. And let me just mention that an interesting biblical framework for the book is that the question of Priscilla arriving at the Brook Farm, or arriving at Blithedale rather, is pretty much posing the question you find in the New Testament when Christ says, even you should treat even the least of these as though they were me. So this is in Matthew 25 when he's talking about the last judgment and those who will be saved and damned. So if you extend your charity to even the most lowliest, most exploited and helpless people, you are doing Christ's bidding. And I think when Priscilla is brought to Blithedale, she is sort of a representative, lowly figure, because she comes from this impoverished family where she's been exploited as a medium by Westerveld, and her treatment by Zenobia and Hollingsworth and Coverdale is kind of a benchmark about whether they are truly charitable people. And Moody, of course, is a sort of a caricature of the Old Testament God, who's a moody fellow who's constantly losing his temper and killing off the Israelites. So there's a bit of a theological satire, I think, in the portrait of Moody, because he's hidden behind a bush all the time, like the burning bush, and he's hidden in the tavern when Coverdale goes to talk to him. So it's sort of a ridiculous satirical exploitation of the Old Testament deity in that name, and in a little bit of his behavior.
You know what it reminded me of is there's actually in the New Testament there's actually a figure named Priscilla. That's like
exactly. That's where the name comes from.
Oh, okay.
Early Christian.
So and wasn't she like a helper to Paul or something?
Yeah. She is a figure who was an early Christian. Yes.
Yeah.
And so Hawthorne took her name from the New Testament, and she is a a spiritual young woman who ends up as Hollingsworth's wife, devoted to him, who's spending the rest of his life with a contrite heart because he thinks he killed Zenobia. So Priscilla turns into the exemplary, charitable Christian at the end by supporting Hollingsworth in his desolation. And she's a perfect model of an obedient woman, just like Paul wanted women to, wear veils in church and to not speak in church too much. I mean, the model for the Christian woman would be pretty much quiet and obedient, and Priscilla certainly is that type of woman.
Interesting. What about Moody?
Well, what about him?
I don't know. I just didn't know if you wanted to say anything about him.
Well, just that he has this Old Testament aura about him. I mean, it's sort of as a caricature. He is, of course, began life as Fauntleroy and then committed the crime of forgery. It seems to be the crime that he commits, and he has to go away, leave his community, and disappears. And then, of course, people think he's dead. And when his brother dies, his wealthy brother dies, the fortune goes to Zenobia, and that's the issue in the book. Is Zenobia has the money because she's independently wealthy, and Moody, because of Zenobia's treatment of Priscilla, decides to assert the claim on the fortune that was really his and give it over to Priscilla. So Zenobia loses her money, and the question is, did that inspire Hollingsworth to drop his interest in her and to become interested in Priscilla? Is he just a gold digger going after whatever woman has money to help build his reform establishment? So that's the suspense of the book, that we don't know really who he is, what he's doing at the community, what his relationship is with these two women. And we get that when we hear the story of Fauntleroy that Coverdale inserts into the novel as a little short story.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of the big ideas of the text, and I mean, there's a lot here for people to digest. And I don't know how long we've been going, and
about over an hour.
Yeah. Well, do you want to say a little something about its critical reception then and now?
Well, it was a popular book. Came out in the summer of 1832. I mean, it got some criticism for being sort of somehow influenced by French decadent writers of the 1840s. But I think people enjoyed the persona of Coverdale. It didn't turn into a bestseller by any means, but a lot of people thought that it was one of his better novels. I mean, of course, it was only his third novel by this point. And it's kind of always had a mixed audience in the scholarly community. Some women, a lot of women readers hate Coverdale because of his attitude towards Zenobia. They think he's sort of demeaning towards her. At least the academic critics attack Coverdale all over the place, and they, of course, they idealize Zenobia, as this great martyr to feminist freedom. So it's certainly it's kept its critical interest for the last, since Hawthorne criticism really started getting going in the 1940s and 50s, and there's been a constant stream of books and articles on this novel, so you won't find any lack of critical material to dig into.
It might be my favorite of his.
Yeah, I for long considered it my favorite, and then when I got into The House of the Seven Gables a few years ago, it kind of edged it out. So but I found it very exhilarating to read Coverdale because he's such a sort of modern-sounding guy with his wit and his irony and his sort of skeptical cleverness. So, yeah, I have to say I agree with you that it's for the modern reader, it's quite compelling to read.
Well, hopefully many people will go out and pick it up as a result of this conversation. I hope they do. So,
okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cook. You elucidated so many aspects of the text, and I can't tell you how much of an invaluable service that is to humanity and to Hawthorne's legacy.
Happy to do so.
Excellent. All right. Well, everyone have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Dr. Cook, again, and we'll be back soon. We'll talk off air and see what we're going to do next. Take care.
Okay.